So welcome everybody to our Listen, Learn, and Empower workshop. This is our series of health equity workshops that we host by the Health Equity Committee. I'm very excited tonight because we're going to start shifting our focus from learning about our communities to learning about ourselves as individuals and how we can grow to better connect with our communities. If you're joining us newly tonight, I'm Amber Prater, the host and chair of the Health Equity Committee. We're a nonprofit group of volunteers at Healthcare for All Ohioans who are seeking health care for all people in Ohio and the nation. I'm going to put the link to our organization in the chat where you can learn more about our history, what we're passionate about, as well as really learning more about what a single payer universal healthcare system is. Healthcare for All importance of including the people we're advocating for in the conversation, which is why I'm so glad that you joined us tonight to have a discussion about how we can do just that as inclusive leaders. We are very excited to have Dr. Quatez Scott here with us from Colorado, who is serving as the Assistant Dean for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity in Agriculture at the College of Agricultural Sciences at Colorado State University. In that capacity, Dr. Scott is overseeing the College of Agricultural Sciences structural efforts to promote inclusion and to create a welcoming learning and working environment for students, faculty, administrators, staff, and all community partners. He has over a decade of experience in higher education, and he earned his Ph.D. here with us in Ohio at the University of Toledo with a foundations in education. He has a wide variety of research interests, and he's currently teaching at Colorado State University as well as an adjunct instructor at Wright State. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to Dr. Scott, who will be walking us through our workshop tonight, and he'll be able to help set the further learning for the evening. We will have Nancy McCrickard and Dina Magoulias, who will be watching the chat for any questions that pop up so that we can make sure everybody gets their questions answered. We do have the recording on so that the workshop will be able to be referenced back to as well. And without further ado, thank you, Dr. Scott, for being here, and I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you, soon to be Dr. Prater, for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all. So I am Dr. Quatez Scott, or Quatez. I am, again, the assistant dean here at Colorado State University in our College of Agricultural Sciences. So I've been working in higher ed for now a little bit over a decade, and the bulk of my work has been in diversity, equity, and inclusion-related work. So I began mostly working in student services, student affairs, because of my experiences being an undergraduate student. I attended Wilmington College. Go Quakers if anybody is a fan of Wilmington College. But I attended that school, earned an undergraduate degree, a bachelor's degree in communication arts, and I just felt, as somebody who was able to successfully navigate my experiences as a racially marginalized student, that I felt like I had an obligation to give back and create avenues for other students like myself or with similar experiences to be successful as well. So I've now found my footing now working in diversity-related services. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen with you all. So I'm totally okay if someone has like a burning question related to any of the slides that we're coming across, but we have a little bit less than 90 minutes together, so I will leave some for folks to ask some questions. So if it's a burning question and if you're like me, right, I have ADHD too, so sometimes I will forget my question. So I need to get it out right there so we can stop and have that there. And I can answer a question, but if we're going to get into a dialogue about something, I would like to save that until the end just so that we can be respectful of everyone's time. But other than that, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides, and we will go from there. All right. So just some community guidelines. Anytime you get into conversations related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's best to at least start out with these community guidelines as a guide for how we are going to engage in the discussion. We're all entering this space from different places, and I just want to make sure that we are on the same page as it relates to how do we typically get through the conversation and have as best as possible we can our experiences engaging in conversations like this could be just different. Some folks do have extensive experiences with more, like you have Amber side of here, right? She took a class with me that was focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, and leadership. Whereas some folks, maybe it could just be passing conversations that you've had with someone. For some folks, maybe I've never had a conversation like this before. So we're all entering this space from different experiences and varying level of experiences. So it's best for us to at least get some guidelines out there just so we can make sure that this space is pretty cordial. So the first thing that I like to ask folks to do is to be open and honest with ourselves and each other. So just be authentic as we possibly can be in a respectful manner, right? So we're all coming to this space not only with varying levels of experience engaging in the conversation, but we're all coming with varying levels of experiences as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion related issues. So be open and honest about your personal experience while also creating space to accept the experiences of other folks. Only share your personal experiences using I, and, or we statements, right? So, you can talk about and name an experience that you came across or that you heard of from someone else, but let's not talk about the personal experiences of those things, right? So it's one thing to say that, I saw this incident happen or I was told about this incident from someone else, but it's a different thing to talk about how that person felt because we are not that individual and those folks may not necessarily be here to talk about that specific example. So let's try to keep those personal experiences and feelings to I and or we. Share the space with one another, right? So being able to step in when you feel the need to go ahead and step in and add to the conversation, but also like to ask folks to step aside to create space for folks to do the same. And then trust intent, but name the impact. What this means is that if there does get to a point, right, where maybe there is some tension with a point or something that has been made, it's okay to, start off by naming, hey, this was my intent when I said this. It was not my intent for the conversation to go this way, but you also name and honor the impact. But I respect that you felt this way and that this had this impact on you. I think that helps folks to, one, feel heard and be seen inside of that space, but it also gives us the space to acknowledge these were my intentions when I stated this. Try to enjoy this time and space together, which is funny when you tell people like, hey, here's a guideline, enjoy the time together. So I do like to ask people to do that as best as possible. And as always, take care of yourself, right? If you need to step aside for any given reason, please feel free to do that. So if there are other community guidelines, this space, feel free to put those inside the chat. But then other than that, we'll just go ahead and move forward with the conversation. So I apologize if this all just came on the screen at once. I thought that I staggered these, but it's also good to lead these conversations with having some general definitions. So we see inside of what we're talking about today, right, with the foundations of inclusive leadership, you have two terms in there that are different, right? So you have inclusive or inclusion, and then you also have leadership. So it's important for us to be able to break those down to understand where are the overlaps, but then also what distinguishes those from each other. So when we're talking about leadership, there is no universal agreement on the definitions of what leadership is, but there typically are some agreements as to what leadership ultimately looks like. So there's two themes that we typically go with, which are the transformational positional. So positional acknowledges authority and power to individuals, which are often derived from some formal title or roles within an organization. This typically is known as the vertical structure of leadership. So it's like looking at a business or an organization and you can identify who the directors or the CEOs or the board of trustees are. Those are positional folks who serve as leaders inside of an organization. Then you have the relational. So these are individuals where the focus is on areas such as influence, trust, collaboration, respect, relationships, and accountability. This is more of the horizontal and vertical structure, right? So this is the 2-for-1. you have individuals inside of an organization that may not necessarily have the positional title of being a leader in an organization, but it doesn't mean that how you conduct yourself and how you work within the organization is not necessarily is not void of leadership. So you have to leadership. Then we have inclusion. Inclusion refers to the level of belonging, value, and respect people feel as members of an organization. So one thing that I like to start off with as it relates to inclusion and being able to define it is the level of belonging. So there are times when you can measure how folks feel valued and if they feel respected and what their experiences are within an organization. You can measure it, and sometimes you can qualitatively assess how that's going, right? Based upon your interactions and your conversations with folks. Think about the times when you've worked in an organization or been a part of a team and you've come across someone, particularly someone who may have a minoritized identity within that space, who says to you, right, like, I don't feel like this person respects my opinion, or the team itself doesn't necessarily respect my thought. I on a lot or trusted a lot with a lot of the efforts that we are engaging in. These things are reflective of inclusion within that particular space. So one quote that I really like that came from this book, which is called Cultures of Growth, is that the authorities on whether an organization is truly inclusive are those from structurally disadvantaged and historically excluded backgrounds. What this means is that you can, let's go back to our guidelines, right? Our agreements to start off with. You can have the best intentions within an organization that can still land short, especially when it relates to people from marginalized identity groups. As leaders, as individuals, as human beings, many times we enter into spaces and we operate by our inherent experiences, right? So if you have learned to navigate spaces and conduct yourself in one way, or to lead in one way, that may not always be reflective of having experiences working with people who typically come from marginalized identities and communities. So with that, that's what refers to as the blind spot, right? Like not necessarily knowing how the ways that you're leading or the ways in which you're organizing the team or coordinating events and working together are also reflective of folks whose lived experiences are coming from experiences that are just different than yours. Because of that, that is likely to lead to a lot of tension. And a lot of research does show that the more diverse a team tends to be, the more there tends to be some cultural clashes. Now, that's not inherently bad, because if you are a person who is engaging in work like we're doing today, right, understanding the foundations of what it means to be an inclusive leader, it helps out to have, it helps to enhance your toolkit, if you will, to be able to learn, how do I engage with folks who are coming from different lived experiences myself, in which they know that they are members of the team, not that they just feel that they belong, but they know that they belong here, as well as they know that they matter within this particular space. So it's important for us to, again, acknowledge that when we are looking at inclusion, the foundation and the base of that must always start with the individuals who have marginalized identities within that particular space. And then we transition to inclusive leadership. So this is behavior that aims to and ultimately creates a sense of inclusion and group membership. So this is aiming for two things. One is recognizing, again, the intent, right? Having the best intentions for making sure that people who are coming from different lived experiences, minoritized lived experiences, are having, as great, if not to some degree, right, even better than they thought experiences within the organization, and not just necessarily, operating or being a part of the team or being there and being often overlooked. But how is it that our intent is also leading to results that show that this actually is a really inclusive space that we have? And I'm going to pause there for a second, because I keep saying minoritized or marginalized. And for folks who may not know what this means, there's a difference between minority, and then being marginalized and minoritized. So I'll use the example of where I currently work. In a college of agricultural sciences, in our college, we have white males who are actually the minority as it relates to our student population from a racial standpoint within our white student population. Historically, white males are not marginalized, right? Because if you think about agriculture today, typically what folks think about are white males. Marginalized individuals are folks who are coming from communities that are historically a minority that are often pushed on the margins of whatever that particular space is. So these are individuals that have historically a minority background or a minority identity that often have a lot of barriers that they face in order to navigate that particular space. So there's a difference between, in our college, white males being a minority and then students of color or people of color being historically marginalized due to a lot of the challenges faced with being able to enter into agricultural spaces, like land ownership and different things like that. There's a lot of history that we can point to identify policies as well as procedures and everything else that shows that there are a lot of barriers that were created to minoritize folks of color entering into those spaces, as well as when you think about women as well, right? Thinking about a lot of the barriers that they have faced in operating the space as well. And then now beyond the gender binary of male and then female, now we're entering into spaces in agriculture where we're also talking about those individuals who don't subscribe to gender, right? So non-gender conforming individuals or those members who are part of the LGBTQ community. And then what does that look like as well? So when I'm talking about minority versus marginalized is recognizing the systems in place that create barriers for that particular group of people. And the minority is simply recognizing the underrepresentation of the people who belong to that particular identity group. So back to inclusive leadership. Inclusive leadership also encompasses a mindset that believes all organizational members, particularly those from underrepresented and historically marginalized groups, are experiences that respect their humanity, acknowledge their cultural differences, and normalizes their experiences in the life of the organization. So this, again, takes a growth mindset with basic human fundamentals of understanding that a person is a person and that person deserves our full respect inside of this space. So it's being able to look at what policies, practices, procedures that we have in place that acknowledge the humanity of everyone inside of this space, and then what policies, practices, and procedures are in place to also welcome a lot of those differences as well. Just using myself as an example, in the class that I teach, I recognize that as a university, Wright State University recognizes federal holidays, but there are a lot of students who come from communities and backgrounds that celebrate or have cultural celebrations that aren't always federally recognized. Because of that, there are times when school is still in and that functions are still going, and it's also conflicting with whatever the calendar is for that particular student's religious or non-religious. It's a cultural celebration or acknowledgement that they have going on. So inside of my syllabus, I always remind students that, one, recognizing the limitation of our academic calendar and how it's not always receptive to or acknowledges students who come from historically marginalized backgrounds and some of those cultural celebrations. So what I do instead is I invite students to let me know if there's anything that is coming up for you inside of your own lived experience that conflicts with our calendar, to let me know when that's going to happen so that we can work around whatever assignments are due at that particular time so I can make some accommodations for you. That is a very student-centered is what we call it, right? But that's also just a very inclusive practice in my classrooms. And then inclusive leadership also leverages the team diversity to accomplish goals and address challenges. So it's being able to ask ourselves, how can we lean on the folks who do come from either minority or minoritized backgrounds to help problem solve some of the challenges that we do have, or even position folks to make us aware of some of the things that could conflict with whatever it is that we're looking to engage in, right? So that being used as an opportunity to help build our capacity, our cultural confidence, one, and our understanding of some of the things that we're doing and what the limitations could be behind that, and then actively responding accordingly, right? So I tell people all the time that hearing is an ability, listening is a skill. So not just positioning folks who are coming from these communities to tell us that, hey, here's something that I can see as a problem, and then, saying, oh, thank you for sharing that with us, and not doing anything about it. That is a hearing. That's an example of hearing. The listening piece of that is being told that, hey, we're going to engage in this particular activity, or we're looking to implement this particular policy. Have we thought about what this looks like with this particular community? I'll give you all an example. It was a few years ago here at Colorado State. There's what's called the Undie Run on our campus. So it's a fundraiser where students will literally run across campus fully clothed, and they'll discard their clothes across campus, ultimately getting down to their underwear. And then everything that's discarded across the mall is generally donated. So in our residence life team, we were talking about what do we do to, one, make sure that students are safe, right? Because if you're talking about people getting down to their undergarments, ultimately there's a chance and likelihood that some sexual assaults could ultimately happen. So in the midst of talking about all of that, and we're talking about what we're going to do back in our residence halls, there was another colleague that said, also think about who you have staffing your front desk, because we do have students who come from religious backgrounds where they are not allowed to see people down to their basically down to their skin. That was one of the moments where I had not thought about that in my own personal life, where I was really thankful that they did bring that up. So that particular example is one of the things that I tend to think about whenever we're engaging in, or I'm sitting around a table with folks, thinking about what policies or practices that we can implement. Always being able to think about what are the things that I'm not thinking about that could create a challenge in this particular situation, and specifically what, from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint, could be some of those particular challenges. So I'm not seeing any questions or anything, so I'm just going to advance the slide. So first things first, before you can ultimately become an inclusive leader or engage in inclusive leadership, there has to be some form of commitment. So I love this quote from Quatez and Posner, and Amber, this should be really familiar to you because I start this off in the class that I teach as well. But what they state is that you cannot fully commit to something that isn't important to you. No one can. You can't fully commit to something that doesn't fit with who you are and how you see yourself. In order to devote the time, to expend the energy, and to make the sacrifices, you have to know exactly what makes it worth doing in the first place. What they are getting to inside of this is that I was just having a conversation with a colleague earlier who also is a diversity. And one of the things that he talked about is that he sees this work as a job. So if you see doing this work as more of, well, I have to do this because this is just like what I have to do or what I've been tasked to do, I think of that more from the positional standpoint. But ultimately, you have to think about how well and to what degree your efforts are going to be effective if you are not personally committed to doing this work. If you are someone who truly believes that every person is a person, every person's humanity deserves to be respected, that all of the disadvantages or the gaps, the diversity gaps that we see within an organization, if you believe personally that we have a responsibility to address those challenges, you will likely be way more impactful and way more effective in your efforts because you're an individual who would send the energy that it requires to do said things. when we don't necessarily take that particular approach to doing the work, that's often when we see a lot of our efforts fail. And that's not to say 100% that's the reason why that is, right? Because we live in a society now where you can have the best intentions as it relates to doing diversity and inclusion related work. And you have folks who may not necessarily be fully aware or may have some level of ignorance as it relates to the challenges of this work that do create the barriers for it, as we are starting to see and continuing to see within our society. So again, for you all, it's being able to think about what is your commitment and then being able to establish what that looks like. So I'm going to take a quick minute to go into an exercise that I like to also facilitate across groups as well. I was going to have you all engage in this effort use text messaging and like all this other stuff. But we don't have to do that. We can actually just use the chat box. So inside of the chat, what you will see on all of these screens or on your screen, I'm going to have 3 different hats that will pop up at different times. So what I would like for you to do is to describe or use words that characterize someone who wears that particular hat. So on the screen right now is the image of a yellow hard hat. And I would like for you all to begin sharing inside of the chat box, what is the descriptor of someone who would wear that particular hat? Construction worker, hardworking. Tough, swears a lot. That's funny. Being pulled away. Oh. Steel worker, hardworking outside, dangerous work, cat calls. Very interesting. Risky worker, awesome. All right, I want to transition to the next one. Oh, if it'll go. There we go. So what's on the screen now is the image of a hat typically worn by someone who is in the military service. So respect, obeys orders, military follows leader, military, war, violence, January 6th, defendant, military, everyday military dress. Thank you all for that. And then the last one. Like dedicated following one. Young. That's fair. Now, usually, gangsters, I usually, would put up like a hat that's the opposite, a sports hat that's opposite of whatever the sports community is. So I know that Michigan game was not too long ago, so I didn't want to go there. All right. Sassy, confident, gangster, fun. So I'll tell you all about some of the responses that I got the last time I facilitated this, but it was actually in San Francisco. So of course they hate, there was a lot of people that hate the Raiders. I had some really interesting responses from the folks that were there about this particular hat, but some of them were talking about, like if you were to see somebody in San Francisco wearing this hat, this is somebody who was trying to be defiant, and was ultimately trying to test the people that were from San Francisco, because they're saying like if you grew up like wearing that hat, you should know, right? Like from a cultural standpoint, like that's not going to fly. But that was really interesting. And then the military hat, it was an immigrant family or a person whose family immigrated here, and I forgot what country that they came from. But they talked a lot about their dislike for folks in the military because where they were from, the military was often used to terrorize the communities where they came from. So it's really interesting to see that duality of the folks who think about honor, respect, and different things like that, and then the folks whose experiences come from a place of terror, from being terrorized, when the military is ultimately used to do that. So, all right, the questions that I have for you all here. Now, there's a list of them, so you don't have to think about or share any of these or answer all of these. But if anybody would like to unmute yourself, that stand out to anyone that you would like to respond to.
Nancy shared with us that she commented on the military hat obeys orders, and she assumed in that manner that everyone who wears a military hat blindly obeyed orders. She shared that she didn't feel that that was very fair to everyone who wears a military hat because she knows that not everyone is just blindly obeying orders who are in the military, and she is recognizing her bias in that manner, that she is just assigning a trait to everybody who's wearing that uniform. Unfortunately, Nancy's voice didn't record very well for us on the recording.
Yeah, that's a really great point, right? Like thinking of the folks who are in service that are required to take orders, and thinking that not everyone who takes those orders take those orders willingly, right? That's one of the things that I came across a couple years ago. I was at the gym working out, and I forget what holiday it was, but it was one of those, saw a service member and then thanked him for his service. And I just remember him saying, please don't thank me for that. And I was like, you don't like to be thanked for that? And he said, no, and he wasn't meaning it to be rude. He said, no, but like many of you all have no, what we have to do while in service, and not all those things are things that we should be thankful for. And it really put back down about we shouldn't say now those the best way to acknowledge their ultimate sacrifice, or their sacrifice to our country, right? Because not all of it ends in somebody sacrificing their life. Sometimes, from a life or death standpoint, but sometimes it's the life that they sacrifice back here as well, right? Spouses, and sometimes that service ultimately breaks home. Everything goes into it. Also, sorry to hear, Amber.
I'd like to answer number two.
Oh, there you go.
I thought my responses were bittersweet. I saw how a hard hat, for example, could be a very competent person, but if you suggested a change to that person and what they're doing, they wouldn't be happy with that. And the military, I feel, is very bittersweet in that, yes, I appreciate the sacrifice and what they're doing for a larger cause, but essentially they are there to kill people. And that's really troubling to me. And the baseball cap, I would say, okay, he's a fan of that group, but it is an exclusive group, and people are part of a tribe in that. And so one tribe against another.
Thank you. What about you, Amber?
Yeah. Before I go, there was a question in the chat from Bill. He asked if the military man that you interacted with had suggested how to respond or how to thank them for their service.
No, so I didn't ask that. That's a great question. I wish that, because I was so caught off guard with that part, it was one of those moments when, someone poses something back to you and you sit and you think like, wow, like I really didn't think about that. So I'm a processor. So it was one of those, like I sat and just kind of thought about like, wow, that's pretty deep. Like really don't consider what goes into all of that. So yeah, that's why I said I'm still trying to figure out myself of like, how do you acknowledge someone, who served their country with also acknowledging not all service is honorable, right? Not all aspects of service are honorable. So that's a great question. Kathy, is that how you pronounce it?
Hi, please forgive me for not turning my camera on. I don't want to scare anybody today. But in thinking about how to respond, because I say that to people all the time. I say, thank you for your military service. But sometimes I say, thank your family for their sacrifice for your service. Because there's no doubt about their sacrifice to any family member of any military person. Sometimes that crosses over that, but because I certainly heard that same sentiment. Anyway, yeah. I was definitely knee-jerk reaction to every one of your questions about the hats. I was not being a little bit fair. Thank you.
No problem. And is that how you pronounce your name, Kathy?
That is correct, Kathy.
All right, awesome. Thank you. And then Kendall?
Yeah, I'll take a little bit of an objection on the military people are trained to kill. That is our primary MOS, but that's not what we're field for. I was a construction engineer. I wasn't there to kill anybody, but I was trained as I was attacked to kill. It's just not all military people are out in the field killing people. It just there's other jobs besides killing people in the military.
Yeah, that's a good point too, right? There's definitely diversity of jobs within the military service as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And then last one, Amber, before we move on to the next one.
I would, the first question stuck out to me because it was difficult for me to think through. Is this my opinion of the person wearing that hat, or am I like being influenced by something else? And that stood out for me with the military hat, bringing it up again, because for me, I come from a background where my grandpa is a veteran, but a lot with recent politics, I feel like the military in general, for me personally, has gotten really heavily associated with a lot of heavy nationalism and like very heavy right-wing politics. And so as soon as I see like camouflage, as soon as I see military, that's what I'm thinking. And I have a very negative connotation about it now. But I would agree with the sentiment, like that's not very fair to put that on everybody in the military, because I certainly have friends who are not associated with that at all. So for me, it was kind of difficult to sort through all of that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Some really great perspectives. Our biases, all of us have biases based upon some experience that we have, and some of those experiences are direct, and then some of those experiences are often indirect. And it's important for us to remind ourselves that sometimes these assumptions don't stop at a hat, right? The next part of that can be the uncomfortable conversation is if you were to begin to put up social identities on the screen. What percent, right? Like very rarely, if I was to put up, racial categories on the screen, what comes to mind when you think of this person, right? That tends to be a little bit more of an uncomfortable conversation to jump into for a lot of reasonable reasons. So it's really easier to kind of ease into that conversation when we do something with an object such as a hat. But it's a reminder for us that all of us are entering spaces with a lot of preconceived notions about a lot of different things, or a lot of perceptions based upon either, again, our direct or indirect experiences. So that's the same thing as it relates to being an inclusive leader. Many of us will have ideas in mind about what that particularly looks like, but we also have to remind ourselves that even some of the best leaders don't necessarily encompass all aspects of what it looks like to be an inclusive leader. One area for myself that I am personally growing in is understanding the huge diversity within the LGBTQ plus community. I am definitely an advocate and support the community as much as I possibly can. I also know that there is a huge diversity within that particular community. Oftentimes as a society, we conflate all of their experiences together. And then also there are many times where we fail to recognize that there are certain demographics within that particular community that are at a lot higher risk for things like, violence. You have transgender Black women who are more susceptible to being killed for being who they are than any other demographic within the umbrella of the LGBTQ plus community. So that is one area where I definitely am an advocate and try to do my best to align myself with a lot of their challenges. But I know that I'm also challenged with understanding just the huge diversity within that area as well. So for each of us, right, like we're all going to be looking to do our best, but it also is a reminder that there will always be room to grow. I was going to do a group share here, but I want to make sure that we are ultimately making progress. So we're about 45 minutes in, and we have 45 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get through all of the slides. So we talked about personal commitment, right? Now it's about what does personal commitment ultimately look like? So that last slide I had on here, one of the questions is, how do you define commitment? And then what are your personal reasons for committing to inclusive leadership? If you would like to add those things inside of the chat, you can go ahead and do that. But I just want to make sure that we're saving space for questions at the end. So what does personal commitment ultimately look like to you? And one of the things that I've been reading lately is this book called Four Pivots, or The Four Pivots. A lot of this work is about reimagining the work of justice within society, but I really love the approach that this author takes at the beginning, which is that part of our own personal pivot is that we have to become more aware. And part of becoming aware is recognizing what power ultimately looks like within society, and that power really starts with us. Power is doing the internal work before you can begin to do the external work. We can't look at our neighbor's house and be critical of what it needs to look like and try to go offer them a hand when your own house has to go through its own updates and renovations and different things, right? So I love what he says, which is when we don't turn inward to deal with our own stuff, we build up this false idea about power and ultimately build movements with wounded warriors. So what he's talking about here is us building these movements with wounded warriors, is that we will ultimately engage in efforts of aligning ourselves with collectives of people who are ignoring the internal work first, that are looking to do the outward work. So again, how are we taking our own power to recognize what our own shortcomings are, what our challenges are, and then looking to do ultimately that work in that area. What you see there on the side, for those who are looking at the screen, there we go, we're back. So our biases, all of us have biases based upon some experience that we have, and some of those experiences are direct, and then some of those experiences are often indirect. And it's important for us to remind ourselves that sometimes these assumptions don't stop at a hat, right? The next part of that can be the uncomfortable conversation, is if you were to begin to put up social identities on the screen. What percent, right? Like very rarely, if I was to put up, racial categories on the screen, what comes to mind when you think of this person, right? That tends to be a little bit more of an uncomfortable conversation to jump into for a lot of reasonable reasons. So it's really easier to kind of ease into that conversation when we do something with an object such as a hat. But it's a reminder for us that all of us are entering spaces with a lot of preconceived notions about a lot of different things, or a lot of perceptions based upon either, again, our direct or indirect experiences. So that's the same thing as it relates to being an inclusive leader. Many of us will have ideas in mind about what that particularly looks like, but we also have to remind ourselves that even some of the best leaders don't necessarily encompass all aspects of what it looks like to be an inclusive leader. One area for myself that I am personally growing in is understanding the huge diversity within the LGBTQ plus community. I am definitely an advocate and support the community as much as I possibly can. I also know that there is a huge diversity within that particular community. Oftentimes as a society, we conflate all of their experiences together. And then also there are many times where we fail to recognize that there are certain demographics within that particular community that are at a lot higher risk for things like, violence. You have transgender Black women who are more susceptible to being killed for being who they are than any other demographic within the umbrella of the LGBTQ plus community. So that is one area where I definitely am an advocate and try to do my best to align myself with a lot of their challenges. But I know that I'm also challenged with understanding just the huge diversity within that area as well. So for each of us, right, like we're all going to be looking to do our best, but it also is a reminder that there will always be room to grow. I was going to do a group share here, but I want to make sure that we are ultimately making progress. So we're about 45 minutes in, and we have 45 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get through all of the slides. So we talked about personal commitment, right? Now it's about what does personal commitment ultimately look like? So that last slide I had on here, one of the questions is, how do you define commitment? And then what are your personal reasons for committing to inclusive leadership? If you would like to add those things inside of the chat, you can go ahead and do that. But I just want to make sure that we're saving space for questions at the end. So what does personal commitment ultimately look like to you? And one of the things that I've been reading lately is this book called Four Pivots, or The Four Pivots. A lot of this work is about reimagining the work of justice within society, but I really love the approach that this author takes at the beginning, which is that part of our own personal pivot is that we have to become more aware. And part of becoming aware is recognizing what power ultimately looks like within society, and that power really starts with us. Power is doing the internal work before you can begin to do the external work. We can't look at our neighbor's house and be critical of what it needs to look like and try to go offer them a hand when your own house has to go through its own updates and renovations and different things, right? So I love what he says, which is when we don't turn inward to deal with our own stuff, we build up this false idea about power and ultimately build movements with wounded warriors. So what he's talking about here is us building these movements with wounded warriors, is that we will ultimately engage in efforts of aligning ourselves with collectives of people who are ignoring the internal work first, that are looking to do the outward work. So again, how are we taking our own power to recognize what our own shortcomings are, what our challenges are, and then looking to do ultimately that work in that area. What you see there on the side, for those who are looking at the screen, is ultimately a mirror. What he says is that the work of inclusion is ultimately about moving beyond having a lens for what inclusion looks like, and then positioning ourselves to look in the mirror. So how do we look in a mirror and see the work that first needs to be done with ourselves before we then begin to move forward and do that work with other folks? Self-awareness is critical to individual and collective progress, and we're going to talk about self-awareness a little bit more in depth here in a second. Learning about distinct aspects of inclusive leadership, right? So how are we distinguishing, again, inclusive leadership from leadership in general? Of course, there are often some overlaps as it relates to inclusive leadership and leadership in general, but we have to make that distinct from just leadership in general. Not all leadership is inclusive leadership, as we just talked about, right? Some leadership is positional, and then you have other leadership that's transformational. So how are we making ourselves more aware distinctly of what it looks like to be an inclusive leader? Self-reflection and criticality is ultimately being able to look at ourselves and ask, what am I doing to contribute to the problems or to contribute to the solutions as it relates to the inclusion issues that we are facing, as well as, being a little bit critical of ourselves as well. Could I have done a little bit better with that? But then ultimately making sure that we're not staying in a space where we are spiraling, right? Because you can recognize, and I'm sure many of us have had those experiences where you recognize, I could have been a lot better. I could have been a lot more sensitive to this person inside of this space, or I could have been a lot more comforting to this person when they came and approached me with this particular problem. But if you don't move past the I could have been to what can I do to be better in the future, then ultimately you're going to enter into what's referred to as the shame spiral, which helps no one, right? So we have to give ourselves a lot more compassion and recognize that it's not just about observing what we did that could have been better, but moving ultimately towards the spaces of being better. Battling through diversity fatigue as well. When you are engaged in the work of inclusion, there will be times where it's just a lot. And I go back to anyone who is familiar with the work of James Baldwin. By the end of his life, this was a couple of years before he ultimately passed away, but he was a social critic, Black author who was really critical of racism within the U.S. And he was interviewed toward the end of his life, and he was asked, "Are you optimistic that things will ultimately change in the U.S.?" And he said, in order to do this work and to be effective, one can only be optimistic. He said, but the human part of myself is that I have to be realistic. You can be both, right? We can still be realistic about where we are and what our issues are and what the challenges are ahead. But if you're not optimistic that things are going to change, it's going to create a lot of roadblocks as it relates to making progress in these areas. So that is a very fatiguing thing to come across. And if you get to a point where you say to yourself, I'm just really tired, I just don't know how much work there is that I can take or that I can do to make progress in these particular areas, that's simply just diversity fatigue that is settling in. And I promise that you are not alone as it relates to that. One of the ways that you can battle diversity fatigue is to, one, remind yourself, what will happen if I stop this work? And then the other thing is to remind yourself that there are a number of people who are on this call right now. And there are a lot of people that I would imagine in your personal lives that you have great relationships with, that you can lean on and connect with and talk to and say, hey, I don't necessarily know what my next steps are. Because I'll be honest with you, sometimes the work is so expansive for myself that you're consumed with it, that it's hard to see what the alternative options are as it relates to moving forward within the work. Sometimes it's about going to somebody else and then asking, hey, this is what I'm dealing with. This is where we are. I just don't know what to do next. I'm just so flustered with everything. And then having a sounding board with somebody who can offer some points ahead, some alternative perspectives on what it is that you're dealing with and what your options ultimately are. All right, next slide. So inclusive leadership, right? So we talked about it in general, but I just want to make sure that we understand the differences between what all of this looks like. So from an inclusive leadership standpoint, if you are taking the positional perspective of this is more about diversity management. Diversity management focuses on planning and implementing organizational systems and practices to manage people so that the potential advantages of diversity are maximized while its potential disadvantages are minimized. So the core concepts behind this particular approach is authority and power, right? Recognizing who ultimately is the person who's responsible for the decisions that are made within the organization, whether or not a policy can be changed or how a policy can be changed or otherwise. They're responsible for managing issues, delegation, as well as they typically move toward the business case for diversity. These are individuals where if someone is to say, hey, I feel like, we can make a lot more progress doing this particular thing, Usually what they start with and end with is what is going to be the financial cost of this, and then what is going to be the return on ultimately the investment. So sometimes that business case, while it can invite spaces for us to be more creative with our efforts, sometimes if we overly rely on the business case, what you're telling yourself is that you're willing to also see those efforts fail because we're not willing to move forward if there's not a significant return financially on the investment of whatever those particular efforts are. So the counter to that is transformational or relational leadership or leaders, right? So these are ultimately what we refer to as change agents. So these individuals focus on creating a vision and culture that prioritizes diversity, equity, and inclusion while inspiring and empowering others to actively contribute to an inclusive environment. The core concepts that we see under transformational or relational leadership are relationships, right, are the focus. Systemic and systematic change within the organization, focusing on promoting belonging and cohesion, as well as at the end of the day, we just have moral and ethical responsibilities to ensure that we are moving in the best way forward and that the bottom line is human and not financial. So you see these kind of opposite of each other, right? The authority versus the relationships, the managing issues versus systemic change, the delegation versus making sure there's belonging, cohesion, and collaboration, as well as the business case versus what is our moral and ethical responsibility. So I think that these are really great points for you all as you are engaging in efforts, regardless of whatever it is that you all are doing, of being able to ask ourselves, is what we are talking about and the way that we are talking about things, is this reflective of positional leadership or positional concepts, or are these reflective of transformational concepts or relational concepts, right? Are we focusing on just managing the issue, or are we ultimately looking to transform the situation that we have at hand? So there was a study that was done, there was a study of organizations, and they were looking to identify what are some of the major traits or themes that we can identify, as it relates to inclusive leadership. And they found that there were 6 signature traits. So the number one trait, or not number one, but in no particular order, is visible commitment, humility, awareness of bias, curiosity about others, cultural competence, and effective collaboration. I'm going to go through each of these. So the first one, right? Visible commitment. Inclusive leaders show authentic commitment to diversity, challenge the status quo, and then hold others accountable and prioritize diversity and inclusion within the organization and its efforts. So the ways in which they do this is that they often add practices and policies to increase diversity while also promoting inclusion. So working in higher education, one of the things for me that I often go to that really is interesting that I observe in higher education, typically today, we see a lot of institutions at the very beginning of the year, they have these, this is the most diverse class that we have ever had entering Colorado. We actually did that at Colorado State or at Wright State or at The Ohio State or the University of Michigan, whatever the institution is. But you have a lot more institutions that are, cheering very loud about, our institution, this is the most diverse class that we have ever had entering into this particular space. The problem that I often find is that I don't hear a lot of institutions saying 4 years, 5 years, or 6 years later that this is the most diverse graduating class that we have ever had. So what that shows is that you have a lot of diversity efforts that focus on increasing recruitment of students who are coming from racially minoritized backgrounds, but the efforts that we have in these institutions don't create those same avenues for those students to graduate at the same pace as what typically are their white counterparts in higher education. So that shows to me that we really are failing as it relates to our inclusion efforts within the institution. That's the same thing organizationally speaking. What are the things that you all are doing to not only promote recruitment of diverse talent, but what are we also doing to show our commitment to retaining our top diverse talent as well? Provide resources to support personal development. Oftentimes, we work in spaces where there isn't a lot of development, and as it relates to resources that are shared with folks, and how they can, and promoting folks' the cultural competence development. So it's important for us to show our inclusive commitment by being able to offer, hey, I came across this reading, or I came across this book, and I thought that this would be really great for us. You have a lot of folks that are starting reading groups now. You have institutions or organizations that are now creating funds to purchase books for folks to have. But I think that's a really solid way of being able to create spaces where folks can kind of learn and grow together. Create space to challenge diversity issues civically as well, right? So if we are sitting inside of let's use that example, I think from Kendall earlier, right? There was a comment made earlier that, about military folks, and then there was a differing opinion for that, right? So it's important for us to create those spaces where we are able to invite differing opinions to the table without also shutting those things down. But we also have to learn how to do that civically as well, right? So a lot of folks, it's not necessarily the difference that you have that is the problem. Sometimes it's just about how we present and engage the difference that makes the difference in ultimately how we respond to those issues. And then cultural affinity spaces and celebrations as well, right? So how do we create spaces where affinity groups can be started, especially ones that recognize and honor the lived experiences of folks who are coming from historically minoritized groups? And then how do we also create spaces that celebrate cultural differences within our organization as well? And I will say that if folks are going to engage in cultural celebrations, that it's always great to lean on the folks who are members of that particular community, because there are a lot of times, right, when folks are engaged in cultural appropriation events or engage in events that the intent was there, but it was super disrespectful. I'll give you all an example of this. I worked at Mercy College of Ohio up in Toledo, and it was Cinco de Mayo was coming up, and they ultimately, they started posting up flyers about the event that was going on, and someone put on the flyer, one of the taglines for the party was "Come have a siesta at the fiesta." Now, I don't know who here knows how to speak Spanish, but a siesta is a nap. So they were asking folks to come take a nap at a party, which I think somebody somewhere clearly heard the word siesta and didn't know necessarily what that meant. And then they put this on a flyer. But that was one example, right, of somebody whose intent was to kind of be funny and inviting folks to have a party, but you actually were kind of being offensive in the way that whole thing was delivered. So again, if you're going to engage in events that have some type of cultural celebration, it's really great to invite folks to the table who will come from those particular communities to help you or really lead the efforts to organize that particular event. Trait number two, humility, right? Inclusive leaders are modest about their capabilities, admit to mistakes and oversights, commit to growth, and create space for others to contribute meaningfully. This includes acknowledging that our understanding of cultural differences is inherently limited. I don't know everything there is to know about everything that I should know. I would just put it as simple as that. So that doesn't mean, though, that I'm not going to take the opportunity to learn and progress as much as I possibly can. So it's about acknowledging the starting point for each of us is that I am limited in my understanding of issues that are affecting other communities that I do not belong to, so on and so forth. We embrace a growth mindset as it relates to that. We publicly are transparent when mistakes have been made. This is something that we tend to not see a lot from organizations and even leaders, but this is actually one of the things that liberates other folks to acknowledge I'm not perfect and that there are a lot of things that I can do better. So it's not necessarily, going online and then making a whole post and then just saying like, hey, like we're terrible because of X, Y, and Z. But if there was a genuine oversight or a mistake with something, it's okay to admit that and acknowledge that publicly. And then also publicly acknowledge these are the ways that we're looking to get better and move forward from this particular thing. I think the misconception is that folks ultimately think that if you say that you made a mistake that was against a minoritized group, all of a sudden, like now you are that ist of an organization versus just recognizing that, no, this is something that we did that we were limited in our understanding of that particular community and maybe this particular issue that was facing this community at this point in time, where we're going to commit ourselves to learning and growing and getting better at that. They ultimately build relationships across communities as well. And you'll acknowledge that, or you'll see, maybe observe that some of these concepts or principles ultimately kind of cross other sectors as well. Trait number 3, awareness of bias. Inclusive leaders show awareness of personal blind spots as well as flaws in the system and work hard to ensure fairness in organizational decisions, including hiring and promotion practices, among others. So this often includes working on our own self-awareness, which I'll talk about in this next slide or the next slides. Educating ourselves is one of the best things that you can do, right? And part of educating yourself is being able to go online, purchase books, read articles, watch documentaries, engage in activities that will really enlighten us to the experiences of that particular community in which our understanding is truly limited. It's not focusing on our individual relationships with people who come from those particular lived experiences. One, because that tends to tokenize that person's particular experience. But the other part of it is that if you lean too much into one person's experience, what you do is you ignore typically the rest of the experiences of folks who come from that. Or what we can get into is confirmation bias, right? As we're talking about confirmation or awareness of bias here. Sometimes we have our own preconceived notions about issues. And if you're talking to someone whose experience or perceptions of it align with yours, then you're then engaging in what is referred to as confirmation bias, right? Engaging folks who are really serving to affirm what it is that we already inherently believed in the first place. The goal of growth is to accept our ability to be challenged and to grow through that, not necessarily just to remain confirmed in what it is that we affirmed and whatever it is that we believe. Being critical of the roots of our decision-making and personal beliefs. So this means that we have to slow down a bit as it relates to the ways in which we are engaging across communities, engaging with the ways that we make decisions, engaging in how we are implementing policies or practices within the organization. But being able to slow down and ask ourselves, where are my assumptions and beliefs about this particular thing rooted in? And is that ultimately fair to everyone who's going to be impacted by the decision that's going to be made here? They engage in active listening, right? So learning to listen more to the folks that you are seated at the table with and not talking as much. And then listening to what our peers and constituents are ultimately communicating to us. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit with self-awareness, but it's really important for us to be observant and cognizant of what is being communicated to us about us. That's going to ultimately help us grow as well. When you have a colleague or a peer who is observing something that you've done that may be limiting their experience with you, how can I be responsive to that particular thing and not necessarily, kind of rejecting or ignoring it or minimizing what it is that they're saying? So as we talk about bias, right, we have to recognize that, and you don't want to talk about being aware of bias without talking about what bias is. So implicit bias is the categorical mental conditioning of perceptions of people across social identity groups that can be real or perceived, right? So many of us, the biases that we have were ultimately formed foundationally in our upbringing. Many of them began to be formed before we were even born, right? Because we're being ultimately shaped and groomed by individuals. We had no choice in who our parents are. We had no choice in what race we were born into. We had no choice into the sex that we were assigned at birth. We had no choice into the schools that we ultimately attended when we were younger, as well as a whole bunch of, if we were brought up religiously or non-religiously, there are many different experiences that we all had that really ultimately serve to form our perceptions and preferences inside of the world, which ultimately contribute to a lot of our biases. So for us, it's about being able to ask ourselves, you know, one, understand that just because you have a bias, it doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes you a product of whatever your environment is and whatever your upbringing is. But if you do recognize that those biases are not serving you well, then the good thing is that you can recognize that I can do something about that. So biases ultimately inform our assumptions and behaviors toward people across identity groups. When we unconsciously or consciously rely on that information about social groups that we pick up in our social environments, again, think about the hats that we just talked about. Most biases, again, are formed in our early adolescence. And then the more we are exposed to certain information, the more that information becomes stored in the mind and likely to be activated later. So it's like saying if you are growing up in an environment with folks who are super sexist and you know, misogynistic and different things like that, if you grow up in an environment that is like that, that's the more likely you are going to engage the world in ways that are ultimately sexist and misogynistic, right? So again, the cool thing about all of this is recognizing that biases are malleable because humans are malleable, and you do have the opportunity to change those things about yourself. Robin DiAngelo stated that racial bias does not prevent us from interacting calmly and respectfully with racialized people when decorum demands it. You can take racial out of this and just refer to it as bias. And just in general, I believe this to be true. Just because someone has bias does not mean that they can't act in a civic manner when decorum ultimately demands it, right? Because we all recognize that there are consequences to the choices and the decisions that we make. So as human beings, people are typically understanding of that and can, you know, operate like so as they engage in the world, but it doesn't mean simply because you're able to do that, that you don't have any biases. And again, we can undoubtedly trace our attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs and perceptions to implicit biases. So I want to screen through like some of these last slides because I want to make sure that I have time for you all, and I apologize, I talk a lot. Self-awareness is actually, all right, I'm just going to speed through and go to this next one. I will pass the slides on to you, Amber, so if you do want to share that with folks, they can have those. Trait number 4, curiosity about others. Inclusive leaders demonstrate an open mindset and deep curiosity about others, including what they do not know. So this includes listening without judgment, using empathy to seek understanding of those around them, being able to distinguish between empathy and sympathy, right? Like not necessarily trying to or feeling sorry for someone, but putting yourself in a position to feel how that person would ultimately feel. The example that I typically use with folks is there's a difference between saying you will never know what it feels like to be a Black man versus you will never understand what Black men in our society in particular ultimately go through. The difference is that if you were not born a Black male, then clearly like that will never happen for you. But there's a lot of research now being conducted that talk about the experiences, the thematic experiences of Black males within our society. So then you can educate yourself and understand a lot of challenges that are facing Black men within our society, right? So you can use that, you can use those experiences to then elicit empathy, right? Like, man, how would it feel to be born a Black man or black male within our society and live through these, or have the theme of living through these particular experiences? How is it that you would think that you would operate in your world if you lived X amount of years with those same experiences? How do you think that you would show up and present inside of the world? Those are the same things that we can use as it relates to other social identity groups as well. Being challenged in their previous beliefs about groups in which they are not a member of. So you can enter into the space and having preconceived notions about groups, but how do you open the door for the possibility of learning and ultimately being challenged in those perceptions as well? and then affirming the lived experiences of those that you ultimately work with as well. Cultural competence, right? Inclusive leaders are attentive to others' cultures and adapt as required. Build relationships across cultural communities really helps out with that, promoting awareness of cultural limitations and practices, policies, and decision-making, right? So is everything that we do reflective of or opens the door to being receptive to folks whose, cultural backgrounds are just ultimately different than the majority of the folks inside of this space, or even what we recognize at the federal level? Inviting cultural celebrations and awareness into the life of the organization, encouraging critical self-reflection when holding people accountable, including ourselves, and then engaging in self-learning activities. Again, like what are some things that we can go back to kind of learn more and be receptive to the things that we did not know and challenging ourselves in those particular ways. So there are 4 aspects of intercultural competence that I think would be really helpful for folks as you look to grow your ability to be more culturally competent. The first thing is recognition, the degree to which a person is conscious of potential cultural differences around them, ultimately without stereotyping people as well, right? So for me, an example of that would be if we're sitting at the table and in my realm, right, in higher education, the general question could be, what experiences are impacting our students here in our college in agricultural sciences? For me, recognition then becomes to how do we shift the question to be more specific, right? So what are the experiences of students of color or Black students or our Latino students or our students from other countries, our immigrant students? What are their particular experiences? What are our experiences of women students or our male students, right? So again, it's not necessarily about asserting this is what you believe is happening, but it's about being critical or inviting into the space. How can we consider the lived experiences of people from different community groups and being specific with that when the conversation demands it? Respect, the degree to which a person is then considerate of those particular differences, right? So not only do we raise the question, but then now we have to ask ourselves, how considerate are we being with those particular experiences? Realization, the cognitive ability to identify the necessary actions or steps to reconcile or leverage those cultural differences. So now that we have considered the lived experiences of these particular communities, how can we use those particular experiences as the benchmark for what we need to do next to respond to the challenges that are present inside of those spaces, right? So it's not necessarily just having the conversation to have the conversation, but now what are the actionable steps that we need to take? And then that's the reconciliation piece of it, right? So it's our ability to heal the harm that's been done that's typically rooted in ultimately cultural differences. The cultural differences themselves are not the issue because they're human nature. All of us are born in different places and we all come from different spaces. The cultural differences themselves are not inherently the problem. The problem is our ability to work through the problems or the lack of our ability to work through those problems. Again, the hope in that is that we all have the ability to work through it because we all are malleable. We're all human beings and we can learn and grow. So next to the ability to learn and grow through it, next then comes the willingness. What efforts are we putting into place to be committed to and ultimately see through the challenges that we need to ultimately make progress in those areas? And then effective collaboration is I believe our last one. So inclusive leaders empower others. They pay attention to diversity of thinking and psychological safety, and then focus on team cohesion. So they share, distribute, and empower others, right? So they ultimately share the power within the space, right? No one is even though we do put responsibilities on certain folks, or we put titles on folks as you are the person that's ultimately responsible, you can still empower everyone that you're working with to create a space of inclusivity. Being aware of who is not participating and what barriers are contributing to this problem, right? When you look around a table that you're sitting with, you ultimately not just observe certain folks who typically aren't participating, but then that's the realization piece of it, right? Then it's what can I do now to invite these folks into the space? Sometimes folks aren't contributing inside of that space, granted, because, some folks don't like to contribute vocally or in front of groups, but you still want to create a space in which they can contribute in ways that they feel the most comfortable. And sometimes that's just reaching out and just asking, hey, I noticed that I didn't hear you talk about this when we brought this up the last couple of times. Can you share with me, can we sit down and talk about your thoughts on it? And if they're sharing with you their level of comfort with that, okay, so then how can I create spaces for you to be involved and feel as if you are ultimately contributing to this? And then, respond accordingly. Build trust through risk-taking moments and activities, right? So risk-taking moments is recognizing that if we are looking at it from a positional standpoint, there are some folks who are around the table who may not have as much seniority at the table, who may not have as much tenure at that table. And that can ultimately create barriers for folks to participate. The risk is knowing that I may be in my first 6 months on the job or first 90 days on the job, and now I've been invited to participate inside of this particular space. And if I'm going to vocalize my concerns, especially if it's running opposite to everyone else inside of this space, that's a big risk because I don't know how that's going to be received by everybody here. So for us, the psychological safety of that is being able to create those comforting moments where, hey, I really appreciate you, responding and bringing up that perspective. We didn't necessarily think about that. Or, hey, thank you for sharing that. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by X, Y, or Z? Creating an inviting space to where folks feel more comfortable being able to step into it instead of feeling as if I say something that is problematic, this could create an opportunity where I could potentially lose my job. But again, we're only going to get better if everyone feels as if they have the ability to contribute to the conversation. So this requires us to rotate who takes the lead or rotate roles within the organization, and for us to recognize that we need to put our egos aside because there is no role that is too big or too small for anyone inside of the space, right? One of the examples that I typically like to use is note-taking within a team setting, right? Who typically is designated as the note-taker, right? And if you can identify that it's usually a woman inside of the space who is taking notes, I need to recognize for myself that as a male, I'm not too big. As a person with a PhD at the table, I am not too big to take notes for everybody at the table. So how can I step in and model for everyone that all of us can take the role of rotating responsibilities, and that no person, again, is too big or too small for any of those. And at the end of the day, one thing to recognize, I love this from Dr. Kristen Neff, and she wrote this book on self-compassion. But she said, when we make a mistake or fail in some way, we're more likely to hit ourselves over the head with a club than put a supportive arm around our own shoulder. In this work of inclusive leadership, no one escapes it without doing harm to anybody. So our intent is always to do well, but the reality is that in many times we will fall short of doing that. You have to be as compassionate with yourself as you would be compassionate to somebody who came to you with some type of issue or thing that they engaged in that may have fell short of ultimately what their intent was. Again, we can't try to be something for someone else and not be those same things for ourselves. So acknowledging that in this work, we will fall short, but it's important for us to try to be as self-compassionate and graceful with ourselves as we are with other folks. So I'll leave you all with this, and we have about 7 minutes to go through some questions, but some recommendations and reminders for you all. Inclusion begins with ourselves and extending that work outwardly, right? So the work that we do with inclusion is ultimately an extension of the work that we're doing on ourselves. Impactful leadership focuses on horizontal progress as opposed to vertical efforts. Leaders with good intentions will ultimately and unintentionally do harm in pursuit of inclusion, so no one gets out of it without doing harm again. And it's important for us to be able to distinguish ourselves from being a good person versus being a person who is looking to do good. Focus on being a person who is looking to do good, because if you are looking to be a good person, sometimes that demands perfectionism from ourselves, and the reality is that none of us are perfect. Create a set of principles to guide your efforts for accountability's sake. Within our college, university, we focus on our principles of community. So these are referred to as inclusion, integrity, respect, service, and social justice. If I was to say that there was a limitation behind that, I would say that belonging is not necessarily in there, right? Like, it's important to acknowledge that if you're talking about a community, that there needs to be high levels of belonging for folks to feel a part of that community. And that's different than what inclusion is. So it's also important to decipher between that. Your principles of community, or your principles in general, should be placed as reminders in each of your strategic efforts and engagement. And it's okay to ask questions to learn, but don't expect to always be educated, especially if it's coming from folks who are a part of marginalized communities. And I would also recommend for folks to audit and survey your efforts. Where does inclusion show up in your work explicitly, and where does it need to show up? And then how impactful have your previous efforts ultimately been? And with that, in 7 minutes, I will open the door virtually for questions from you all.
I know Bob Crazen put a couple questions in. Bob, do you want to speak for them?
See if I can remember them. Thank you. I appreciate your insights. You're a very compassionate person. I'm really touched by your spirit. I was wondering if you've ever been a part of a public relations response by an institution to some serious problem that happened within that institution. Have you ever been part of that group that comes together to write that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob, and thank you for the comment. I appreciate that. A few years ago, there was an incident where it was at another institution, and a student, literally the student body president, that's what made it so much worse. The student body president dressed up in blackface, and I forget what the sign he wrote on. He threw a party, and I forget what he put on the sign for that party, but it was something like related to Tiger Woods or something. But it was a whole thing, right? Like, white male, student body president. This thing was like on the cover of the student newspaper. Like, so many students from different communities were, responding to that, and rightfully so, in terms of the hurt feelings and everything with it. So as an institution, we came together. Like, so I was invited to the table to talk about how to respond to this publicly. And part of it was recognizing that this is still it's a learning institution. It's an institution of learning, and recognizing that no person is perfect, and that that student was ultimately taking responsibility. In private, the conversation with him, he wasn't encouraged to step down, but he was pressured to do it by his peers. The institution decided to support him in whatever he chose to do, but recognize that if he was going to continue on as the student body president, that there were a couple of things that he was going to be ultimately required to do. Now it's different, right? We try to not to force people to go through diversity training, but I think that was like one of the things that he was going to be asked to do, was to go through some type of like diversity training. But ultimately, he chose to step down, and he actually wrote a memo to the student body recognizing the lack of judgment and the poor taste in which he approached his Halloween party, and recognized like his own shortcomings with that, and committed himself to getting better with that. But that was one of the instances in which, I was invited to sit at the table and to talk about, from an institutional perspective, how is it that we address it? And for me, like, the center of that was recognizing, like, he was young, like he was 20 years old. He did that because I think that was also coming from a time where now it's like, it's much different now with blackface. But at that point in time, it wasn't as what it looks like now. So I think that because there hadn't been as much anti-blackface that was going on at that point in time, he really was just ignorant to it. So using the word that you used with Mika earlier, I think there had to be a level of compassion with that and understanding where it was that his own lived experience was, while also being sure not to try to paint him as a person who was just racist.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Is it Arlene? If you're talking, we can. Oh, there you go.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Scott. This has been a very valuable session, and I'm sure I'll want to go to our website and read your this session and the notes again, in addition to what the pages I've written down. It's just very helpful. And I once had a professor at Temple University who I think years ago, decades ago, was referring to confirmation bias by talking about cerebral hygiene that we do. And I just know that reflecting on these biases that are ingrown in a compassionate way is very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Was it Dean?
Hi, thank you so much for this very comprehensive talk. I wanted to ask the question that Bob had asked earlier on the chat. He said inclusion is being confronted politically, and he asked you to comment on that and what we should do about it, what we can do about it.
Yeah, inclusion is being confronted politically. I would ask to say more about that. But what am I seeing, experiencing, and what should we be doing about it? Yeah, first, can you say a little bit more about that, Bob?
Sure. I think that there are politicians who are saying that diversity is a bunch of nonsense, and this is something we shouldn't be paying attention to, and that we should put it in the scrap bin of history. I mean, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, okay, I got you. Yes, so there is a big push, and especially in higher education now. Some of the things that we are seeing is what you may all be seeing is a lot of names being changed. So you will see offices that are moving beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion to you can have community for access, culture, belonging, different things of that nature. Ultimately, if you're doing the work that's supposed to be done, then that's as long as those offices are still trying to do the work that needs to be done, that's one thing. But yes, I will say that it is making it difficult ultimately to do the work because what I don't have is a television in front of me, nor millions of people that are listening to me. So when I hear folks that say like, hey, this is like really informative, part of the problem, right, is that we don't have a lot of the folks who have the voices to contribute to, very constructive presentations of what inclusion work really looks like. A lot of those folks are not the ones that are being given the mic. It's the folks who are being frustrated by a lot of the misinformation that is also being shared. I will also say that that's not always 100% on news medias and outlets, because I'm a firm believer that in whatever work that we do, we have to own our side of the road too. I have seen people who engage in diversity and inclusion related work that I don't think that that's like the best way or the most compassionate or the empathetic way of being able to approach it. For me, if I'm coming across someone who is, I believe this thing, I'll give you an example. There was a student when I was in my master's program, right, Eastern Michigan. And one of my colleagues said that she was dealing with a student who came to her office and he wanted to change his room. And when she asked him why, he said, because my roommate is gay. And the way that I was raised, like being gay is a sin, and I don't want to live in a room with somebody who's living in sin. So she said, I responded by saying that, well, I don't believe that that's appropriate, and I'm not going to move you outside of that room because like that's unfair to the other person. I stepped in and said, I was like, I don't think you're listening to like what the student said. I think you did a disservice to the student at the same time. I wish I would have framed it better, but that's how it was at that point. I was still a student. What I said was, if you listen to him, he said he started off with the way I grew up. He wasn't saying like just inherently, I just don't believe this. He's telling you about the way that he was conditioned inside of this world. So instead of taking the opportunity to tell him that he was just wrong, that would have been an opportunity to challenge like what impact that leaves on him and how that's going to limit his experience ultimately inside of the world. In addition to the point that if you were to just reject moving that student outside of that room, you're actually now putting two people in a very contentious situation where harm can ultimately be done. That was another conversation. But for me, it was the compassion piece of it, the empathy piece of it, is starting with, what would it feel like to live in a space that is running contradictory to how you were ultimately raised inside of this world? And that's where I try to use that as often as I can as the starting point for where I understand a lot of issues going on within our society. So I think that's the same thing as it relates to inclusion related work. Some people are introduced to it from the deficit model of it or the anti perspectives of it, instead of being introduced to it from folks who are out doing great work, making meaningful change, and really leading with compassion as it relates to doing this work. Thank you. Mitzi.
I was interested as we began this whole session in my emotional reaction that we were doing something that is now forbidden. And it just interests me that that is your profession, and kind of like Bob had asked, you know, how does that make you feel about the future? Do you feel confident in moving ahead, in guiding people into diversity and inclusion and acceptance? It just seems like we're in a world that just is freaked out about it somehow.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I appreciate you acknowledging that. So one thing that I try to do is that we all should do, right, as it relates to operating within our world, is recognizing what privilege you have. I have the privilege of doing this work in 2024 and not 1964. There were people that were spit on, that were jailed, that were beaten in streets, that were attacked by dogs, that had all these things done to them simply for advocating for civil rights. Now, that's not to say that those things could never happen to me, but the likelihood of those things happening to me in this day and age is a lot less. So I do recognize my privilege and that we're just and the progress that we as a society have made, and that a lot of things are a lot more socially acceptable as well as unacceptable. Like, right, like how it was very normal to see certain things happening back then, that you wouldn't likely see some of those things happening today. So I do recognize that. In general, it goes back to what I said earlier. If I stop doing this work now, what happens, right? And I think that's part of the intent behind creating all of these barriers to doing the work, is if you just put all these walls up, ultimately it'll stop people from doing this work. It just causes us to go back to the drawing board and find more creative ways of having these conversations. And as I forget his name, but what he ultimately said is still finding ways to get into some good trouble, right? Like, I'm okay from a moral, ethical standpoint of engaging in this work and being seen as whatever, if the work that I'm ultimately doing is inherently meaning to create opportunities for the most marginalized people within our society. So that's a hill that I am very willing to die on.
Well, you've done a very good job with this evening, and I really appreciate your thinking and your guidance.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions?
I would like to make a comment. I don't know how to raise my hand on there. Thank you very much. Your presentation was very clear and accessible. I loved your ideas and I love your commitment to what you're doing. I just want to make a brief comment, and that is, I'm assuming that all or most of us operate within an organization, and this is great, but if you do not get the organization and the leadership of the organization to buy into these ideas, it's very difficult to make any progress.
Yeah, that's what I was, and I appreciate John. All right, that's what I was. I made a comment earlier about sometimes the barriers to the work isn't necessarily like us ourselves. It's the detractors, right, and the folks that we are working with, and sometimes ultimately working against. So that's a very great point, and I appreciate that. Yeah, it's one of the things too in higher education. People say that change is glacial. And I don't think that's just limited to higher education, because higher ed is typically a microcosm of what goes on within our society. But I think the same thing is true within society, that change is oftentimes glacial, and sometimes change ultimately is temporary. One of the biggest, speaking of inclusion, right, being a misconception, one of the biggest misconceptions from a theory perspective is critical race theory. People think that people are just being taught that if you are white, you are bad inherently just because you are white. What critical race theory ultimately explores is the intersection behind race and a lot of social challenges that we have. And one of the tenets that Derek Bell ultimately argued about in that theory was that there is really no such thing as racial change, because once you make progress in one area, typically what's going to happen is that there are going to be efforts to reverse that particular thing. Beyond race, right? We see the same thing that just happened with Roe v. Wade, how that whole thing was ultimately overturned. So it's about being able to recognize that we make a lot of changes within our society, but sometimes those changes are very much temporary, and that has nothing to do with the good people or the people that are intending to do good. Sometimes it's just the folks who very much are misinformed and uninformed and limited in their understanding of what some of those challenges are. But yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, John.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, we are 10 minutes over. First off, Amber, do you have any questions for me?
I don't have, well, I have one very specific question for you, but we could talk offline about that.
All right. Well, other than that, I got to get to choir practice now. So if you all didn't know, not only am I a theorist, but I do sing. So I gotta get to my local community choir and get ready for our holiday concert that's coming up this Saturday.
Yes. So thank you so much
for your time.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Scott.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Appreciate your effort.
Thank you all very much as well. And I saw the comment. Yeah. So this belt behind me, this championship belt, one of my best friends ultimately so a little bit about me as well is that I also grew up in the foster care system. So I spent a lot of my teenage years in foster care. So when I finished my PhD, she bought me this belt that has like recognition for my my PhD, but it also has like the other schools that I attended on the way to completing that. So yeah, that's why I have that belt back there. So
Thank you.
All right, no problem. Well, you all take care, and good luck in engaging in this work. And if I can ever provide recommendations for readings and different things like that, just let me know.
Thank you.
That would be helpful. Yeah, a bibliography.
Yeah, well, if I'm going to do it right now, there's two books, right? So the one is The Wake Up. This is a really great book. I started reading this not too long ago. And then the other one is The Four Pivots that I talked about earlier. So Reimagining Justice, Reimagining Ourselves. These are two really great works that I'm reading.
Okay.
Got it. Well, I'll let you jump off, Dr. Scott, because I know you need to go to choir practice.
Yeah. All right. You all take care.
Thank you. And just wrapping up for everyone else, I'll be sending a follow-up email, and I'll do that once I get the PowerPoint from Dr. Scott and that we have the video recording all put together for everyone. And I'll also include a feedback survey link for everyone. So we would love to hear your feedback about the event so that we can always continue to improve the workshops that we're providing for you guys. And of course, you have the link for the website to explore and reach out to everyone. We'll continue to host our quarterly health equity workshops in 2025, and we hope to see you there. Hope everybody has a good night and happy holidays.